Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and to our men's group and life group, and to our study in the third semester of our studies in the theology of Karl Barth. We are going to take a look at Barth's Dogmatics, and we're going to look at Volume 4, paragraphs 57 through 59. We'll begin with paragraph 57 and pages 1 through 10, which is really the introductory comments by Karl Barth. So we're going to begin with a triad consisting of the concept of God with us as history, and God with us as grace. So let's begin by looking at the first block 1. God with us as concept. The concept of God with us is situated between the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of the eschaton of last things. It is the concept for the covenant of atonement, and as concept it functions as the vantage point of perception for every and all Christian doctrine. As concept, it also functions as a sign of signification, a signification of grace and of judgment, reflecting the change in relation as in the narratives from Isaiah and fulfilled in Jesus. And Barth goes on to say that when Assyria emerged as a world power, Isaiah prophesied a change in relation between God and his people as a judgment upon unfaithfulness. That is what he prophesied, but also he prophesied a deliverer, a child would be born named Emmanuel, or God with us. The expected Redemptor King was fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, under the idea of aletheia truth, as concept, God with us is always true in spite of the moments of history. God with us is always a aletheia spiritual truth. And then note 6, the naming of Jesus. The naming of Jesus constitutes a change in relationship between God and his people from perdition to salvation as an eschatological redeeming divine event. So let's move on and take a look at block 2. We're going to take a look at God with us as history. Barth says God is in himself in eternity as he is incarnate in the time of the world. In other words, God's truth of his being equals his act in the world. God's truth equals God's act. Now, existentially, a report about ourselves is always included in the report about God because we live within the sphere of God. God's history is shared with us and does invade our history. We are interpenetrated by the history of God, the divine history. The divine history takes place as our history takes place. We share in God's incomparable act as the history of redemption, as God's history. Now, under teleosis or telos, God's history has an eschatological aim. This includes the specific conjoining of our history with God. Salvation equals perfected being in the future eschatological horizon. God's teleosis of history includes creation, preservation, and the overruling of the world, or what we would call transcendence. So it's very much that tri-dimensional aspect of creation, preservation, and transcendence. But concept and history come together as a synthesized God with us as grace. So if we look at block 3, you'll notice that God's redemptive grace defines the whole circle of God, the entire sphere of God within which we find ourselves. It also makes possible the recognition of God's general grace of creation, preservation, and overruling transcendence. Now, under the idea of primitive God's redemptive grace precedes his work of creation. The ordaining of salvation is the original will of God even prior to creation. God creates, preserves, and overrules in transcendence according to this prior purpose of salvation. Under the idea of relational, redemptive grace equals the revelation and the confirmation of the primitive relationship between God and man as salvation. It is historical. Redemptive history equals where the righteousness of God is revealed and determined for us. Revealed and determined. The eschatological end of doxa glory becomes the basis and the beginning of redemption, and that's very much an idea picked up by Jürgen Moltmann. We can most certainly see there. The eschatological end of doxa glory becomes the basis and the beginning of the redemptive history. It's very, very centered on the idea that Moltmann took out of Barth. Now, note 6. Under sin, God with us also addresses our forfeited, determined salvation. We do not conduct ourselves as partners with God. Humanity seeks self-fulfillment. We confront God as separated by the gulf of the fallen self. And that's the metaphor Barth uses, the gulf of the fallen self. However, we now come to the yet and the nevertheless of God. The yet and the nevertheless of God. God's yet and nevertheless of pure grace is based only on itself. Therefore, our incapacity to satisfy this grace also creates a judgment against us. And Barth says there is a brute fact of grace, and that brute fact is that we have sinned. We cannot run from that conviction. We cannot run from that judgment. The brute fact of grace is that we have sinned. But because of that, Barth says we need to understand that redemptive grace comes as incarnate grace. God becomes man. He takes up our case as the free overruling of God's transcendence and his sovereignty, as the closing of the gulf, as the will to suffer the consequence of our transgression, and in obedience, Jesus accepts the ordination of man to salvation for us as our representative. Tremendous lesson on the concept of God with us. It's so important to understand here that Barth is really emphasizing the sovereignty of God, because he emphasizes the act of God incarnately as that which is no different than God's being in himself. God's truth is equal to his act. But God is with us as a concept. He is with us as Emmanuel, in the naming of Jesus. But his history interpenetrates our history. We participate in the history of God, which is the revealed history of Jesus Christ. And that becomes redemptive grace. That becomes a redemptive grace that is the yet and the nevertheless of redemptive grace, because redemptive grace for Barth is pure grace based only on itself and God's sovereignty. We have been met by the incarnate grace of God becoming man in Jesus Christ, taking up our cause, our case, in a free act of the overruling transcendence of God's sovereignty. And that gives us the tremendous blessing of the closing of the gulf of separation between humanity and God. The overwhelming, incomprehensible closing of the gulf between humanity and God. Because through Christ, God suffers the consequence of our transgression, and Jesus, in obedience, and as the co-sufferer in this action of grace from God, accepts the ordination of humanity to salvation for us in our stead. Tremendous, beautiful lesson as our beginning here on taking a look at the Church Dogmatics by Barth. And all the way through it, we can really begin to understand how Jürgen Moltmann was considered the successor to Karl Barth. There's a reason for that, and I say that the reason for that is exactly that he took up that eschatological aspect of what Barth presented and really concentrated on that eschatological aspect. And that's why I think to understand Jürgen Moltmann as the successor to Karl Barth, I think Block 3, Note 5, under Historical, needs to be reread. Redemptive History, where the righteousness of God is revealed and determined for us through the power of God's sovereignty, means that the eschatological end of doxa glory, or Shekinah glory, becomes the basis and the beginning of redemption. It becomes the empowerment of redemption. There's an eschatological empowerment of redemption because of the positing on the side of the sovereignty of God of this eschatological end of doxa glory for all creation. So I really want you to key in on Block 3, Note 5, on the significance that holds for the entire bulk of Jürgen Moltmann's teachings. He very much takes up that aspect of Karl Barth, and he has been widely recognized as a successor to Karl Barth. That'll wrap up this lesson, and I think we can be excited about this third semester of our learning. In our life group, we've gone from the Gospel of John in the first semester to the Living God by Jürgen Moltmann, which was a tremendous work. And we are going to now finish up our third semester by studying The Doctrine of Reconciliation by Karl Barth in Volume 4 of the Church Dogmatics. And we'll pick up from here next time.